Asia, 1890. It was a continent dominated by two rising empires, staring at each other from across the East China Sea. China under the Qing dynasty, and Japan rapidly shifting from feudal society toward modernization. Both have a hand outstretched to Korea, each with visions of territorial gain and economic potential that they were eager to bring into reality. The other hand, both for China and Japan, rests on the hilt of their sword, waiting, daring the other side to begin the fight. Each believes they can win the battle that is to come. Each understands the sacrifice and pain it will take to achieve victory. And each understands the victory means a clear path to supremacy, not just in Korea, but across the continent of Asia. Both sides are a long way from realizing that dream of supremacy, and neither has the ability to hit the other quite so hard as to destroy their opponent entirely. After all, this was before the time of modern total war, and neither Japan nor China was willing to reorient their entire economy to support a full mobilization. But what they were willing to do was to test their strength against one another in battle, with Korea and its people caught in the middle as a prize for the winner. The conflict that ensued was a blowout, one that ended up stretching far beyond the Korean peninsula by the time it ended, and one that gave Japan the boost that it needed in order to begin pursuit of its own vision of empire. In the years prior to the First Sino-Japanese War, China was very much a country trying to keep itself from bursting at the seams. Its long relationship with European nations had gone sour as the 19th century wore on, as Europe's powerful empires sought to turn China from a mutual partner in trade to a mere producer under the yoke of the British East India Company and a range of other corporate imperial masters. The First and Second Opium Wars saw the Qing dynasties out of date and comparatively meager military, thrashed twice over by Britain, France, and even the Soviet Union. In the aftermath of these wars, China was forced into accepting crippling trade agreements and lost its status as the single dominant empire across East Asia. Not only that, but the Qing dynasty's own sovereignty was severely compromised, and while pro-imperial sentiment was still strong across much of the nation, the actual ability of the empire to assert itself had been badly stunted. China's conditions for surrender included the legalization of the opium trade, land concessions to the major Western powers, mandatory equal status for Chinese Christians, and an economic package meant to bleed China dry. Japan had watched this series of events closely with a mix of surprise and foreboding. If you've watched our Countdown to War Japan video, you'll know that Japan during this time had been coming into its own as an aspiring major power. After the Meiji Restoration had ushered Japan into modernity at a rate previously unheard of. Japan's own relationship with Western powers was in its early stages, so seeing what those powers were capable of in China was a major wake-up call. Over their shared history, China and feudal Japan had had a contentious and sometimes violent relationship, one in which they were well matched enough that each nation could resist the advances of the other. But Britain and France had just tag-teamed China with almost a casual ease, and this presented Japan with two unavoidable realities. First, Japan was not in fighting shape to resist a Western power if it came knocking, and second, Japan's fair trade agreements with those Western powers meant a lot less to the West than they did to Japan. These realizations eventually became Japan's guiding light through the second half of the century as it began to reconcile its aspirations of major power status with the work it would take to get there. These are the circumstances that set the table for Japan and China's later animosity, with Qing China very much on the decline while Japan's power seemed to grow by the day. And it was Korea that became the object of their discontent for a list of reasons on both sides. Strategically, the peninsula was vitally important for any conflict that would take place on the mainland of either nation. An assault from Japan to China or vice versa would require significant work to sustain supply lines across the East China Sea, but if Japan held Korea, it could attack China either by land or by across the narrower Yellow Sea. If China held Korea, they needed only cross an even narrower span to reach the Japanese home island of Kyushu. Korea held significant economic value too. It was China's preeminent client state, with an essentially closed system of trade that funneled goods directly to its next-door neighbor. This was a very good deal for China, one it obviously didn't want to lose, but Imperial Japanese planners had identified Japan's lack of natural resources as its largest barrier in achieving military and economic self-sufficiency, and Korea's reserves of coal and iron offered a valuable jumping-off point if Japan wanted to go out and secure resources elsewhere. It wasn't long after the Meiji Restoration began that Japan started making advances towards Korea. In 1875, Japan instigated a series of skirmishes with Korea, from which it pressed Korea to open itself to foreign trade and declare itself autonomous from Chinese influence in matters of foreign relations. It was a classic case of gunboat diplomacy, and Japan got precisely what it wanted out of the deal. This prompted an escalation of tensions with China, and as Korea began an internal reckoning about its place in the broader world order, both China and Japan did their best to swing the result in their own favor. China supported the ruling monarchy, a conservative institution with strong pre-existing ties to the Chinese state, whereas Japan supported reformists who hoped that Korea might modernize as Japan had done. These political games continued for the better part of a decade, until the Gapsin coup in December 1884. In this incident, a pro-Japan faction within Korea tried to overthrow the monarchy, but failed after 3 days. By this time, Japan and China both had troops in Korea, and while Chinese troops were successful in preventing the coup plotters from achieving their goals, they killed Japanese troops in the process. This threatened to set off the entire diplomatic powder keg, but both sides were able to agree to a mutual withdrawal of troops from Korea, avoiding further escalation. This situation held firm more or less for another decade, and in this time, both sides were hard at work on their broader goals. The Chinese government had taken time to achieve their military and diplomatic priorities, while Japan rode a wave of nationalistic pride through the completion of the Meiji Restoration's major goals. But in 1894, affairs in Korea came to a head again with the assassination of Kim Ok-kyun. Kim had been the leader of the coup plotters a decade prior, and when he was lured to Shanghai by a Chinese general, he was assassinated. This was a direct insult to Japanese national pride and was seen as an outrage on the home islands. After all, Kim had led a movement that sought to be like Japan and had gained the respect and support of Japanese leaders in the process. To make matters worse, when his body was returned to Korea, it was quartered and put on display in a ham-fisted attempt to cow other pro-Japan Koreans into submission. In order to understand what happens next, we've got to zoom in, not on China or Japan, but rather on Korea itself. Around this time in Korean history, a whole lot of people were peasants, and a whole lot of peasants were getting very interested in the religion of Tonghak. With the name translating to Eastern Learning, Tonghak was a nationalistic religion with a few basic tenets. All people are equal, Western culture is not meant for Korea, and Korea should be subject to social reform in order to better align with Tonghak's version of what is right. Shockingly, the monarchy took issue with a few of the ideas we just mentioned, and peaceful protests quickly turned to rebellion in the southern part of Korea. This rebellion was successful at first, and its inherent challenge to the status quo made both China and Japan very nervous. As the rebellion took off, Korea's leaders looked to China for assistance in putting it down. China obliged and dispatched a contingent to Korea. But from Japan's perspective, this constituted a violation of China and Japan's treaty to keep troops off the peninsula. It didn't matter that the Korean king had asked for China's support. China and Japan had both agreed to stay out of anything that came up on the peninsula, and China had broken their word. Tensions were already inflamed after the death of Kim Ok-kyun, and for Japan, this was just the final straw. 8,000 Japanese troops were landed on the peninsula compared to about 2,900 on the Chinese side. By this time, the peasant rebellion had already laid down arms in an attempt to keep both China and Japan off the peninsula. But alas, it was already too late. Korea attempted to defuse the situation, and Chinese forces were made to leave Korea, understanding that the whole thing had just been a big mess. But Japan's leaders saw an opportunity, and they marched their 8,000 troops on Seoul anyway. Within days, they had captured the Korean king, deposed him, and installed a puppet government, which immediately began issuing decrees to kick China's troops off the peninsula. Those troops, however, now had every intention to stay and support the Korean monarchy, as China had done for decades. 1,100 troops boarded the British ship Kaohsiung to cross the Yellow Sea, elite soldiers who made up the cutting edge of China's standing army. But Japan sank the Kaohsiung during a larger naval skirmish, and around the same time, Japan and China faced off in their first modern battle. Fought over a small stream that Japanese troops had been attempting to cross, an outnumbered Chinese force lost a tactical and surprise advantage and was forced to retreat. The Chinese soldiers were able to consolidate with their main force near Pyongyang, and with hostilities clearly underway, they readied themselves to defend the next Japanese assault. At this point, both sides had figured out that the time for war had finally come, and they readied their respective militaries for the task. Japan brought an army of 120,000 well-trained, fairly well-equipped soldiers who were, at that time, still in the process of evolving into the feared Japanese army of the Second World War. On the seas, Japan had a fleet of warships and torpedo boats backed up by some 300 merchant vessels that could be converted for war if need be. Though their fleet was modelled after the British Navy, it lacked most of the punching power of the Queen's. Meanwhile, China was packing a much larger army with nearly 1 million soldiers across various fighting forces. However, they were poorly equipped, with some soldiers forced to use swords and pikes instead of guns, and some of the available guns were antiquated muskets. It was the Chinese Navy that was supposed to do a bulk of the work, led by 2 German-made battleships and backed up by numerous other warships. In the beginning, the First Sino-Japanese War played out a bit like a chess match. War was declared on August 1st, 1894, with Qing forces dug in at Pyongyang while the Japanese advanced through the sea. But despite their initial nervousness, Japan had a much better time than expected in the early naval engagements. This was due in no small part to the Chinese leadership's decision to repurpose naval funding before the war in order to build a palace and provide aid after natural disasters. So even though Chinese and Japanese planners alike had expected Japan to struggle with China's naval might, they instead cut through Chinese supply lines like butter and cut off the forces at Pyongyang. On September the 15th, Japan encircled the city and attacked from all sides. Within a day, they had captured it, sacrificing less than 600 men killed or injured in exchange for 6,000 casualties on the Chinese side. The fall of Pyongyang spelled the end for China's ambition to hold Korea, and instead, Chinese forces fell back to the border in hopes of containing Japan to the peninsula. But on the Yalu River, a naval battle between China's flagship vessels and their accompanying Biang fleet and a group of better armed Japanese ships saw both of China's battleships set ablaze. Though both sides took heavy losses, Japan got the better end of the engagement by far, crippling China's capacity for naval defense and making a Chinese seaborne counterattack almost impossible. From here, Japanese troops blew across the border into Manchuria, and transport vessels were now free to land additional forces wherever they pleased. Japan chose the strategically important Liaodong Peninsula between North Korea and Beijing, which became a beachhead from which Japan could strike outward at several major cities. Mukta, Xi'an, Taluan, and countless villages fell under Japan's sphere of influence, and the city of Lishonku was next. If that name doesn't sound familiar, it's probably because you know the city by its anglicized name, Port Arthur, where Japanese troops massacred thousands upon thousands of defenseless Chinese civilians. The incident caused a dramatic rise in Western attention toward the war, and sadly, it served as a prelude to many of the atrocities the Japanese military would commit between this time and 1945. In Port Arthur and across China, Japan had been going up against greater numbers of enemy troops and meeting fierce resistance, often forced to split their forces and adopt unconventional battle tactics in order to win. Become hook or crook, every major battle ended with a Japanese victory, and the few counterattacks China attempted were repelled. Japan's better troops, their better resources, and most of all, their superior leadership were too much for China to take, and the tide of the war never once swung away from Japan. By this time, it was clear that the Qing dynasty was outgunned and outclassed by Japan's forces, and the remains of their naval fleet met a large contingent of land forces at the harbour of Wei Highway. Here, they would make their stand against Imperial Japan, knowing that the ships didn't have many more options to retreat, and that there were few remaining strategic choke points that could prevent Japan from running amok through the countryside. But after a weeks-long siege, Japan broke through, killing thousands more and annihilating what remained of the Chinese fleet. Making matters worse, Japanese forces were able to take Manchuria around the same time. It was a devastating series of losses for China, and one that left Beijing practically undefended. With the Qing dynasty's seat of power now in the crosshairs, they had no choice. Peace, no matter the conditions, was the only path to survival. The war ended on April 17, 1895, when Japan and the Qing dynasty agreed to the Treaty of Shimonoseki. To the Chinese, this treaty must have looked one part like a cruel joke and 10 parts flashback to the Western demands that had already gutted China's economy after the Opium Wars. The conditions overwhelmingly favored Japan, which would assume full control of Korea after China relinquished its claim on the territory. Japan also received the Liaodong Peninsula, Taiwan, then known as Formosa, and the Penghu Islands. China also paid 200 million taels of silver, opened the Yangtze River to Japanese trade ships, and agreed to devastating economic conditions as well. After all, they had little choice in the matter. If they told Japan anything but what Japan wanted to hear, they would be powerless to stop the Imperial army from taking Beijing by force. There was no other option but to accept the conditions of surrender. But across the world, Japan's quick and decisive victory sent shockwaves through Europe, where the continental powers were aghast at just how powerful Japan had gotten in such a short time. Sure, 1895 Japan's military still wasn't a match for Britain or France, but given what they'd done in just 30 years, the writing was on the wall. Europeans had grown used to a steady diet of cheap, readily available Chinese goods, and they weren't about to allow their prize in the Far East to slip away without a fight. The Western powers took action. Russia, France, and Germany all stepped in to intervene shortly after the Treaty of Shimonoseki took effect, with much of their focus centered around the Liaodong Peninsula. Together, the three nations were able to force Japan to sell the peninsula to Russia in exchange for yet more silver. If you can imagine the feeling of finally starting a fire while stranded in the rainy wilderness, only for your dog to take a leak on the thing and put it out, you might have some inkling of the frustration Japan's military leaders must have felt at this foreign intervention. After all, Japan had just put a glorious capstone on 30 years of complete societal overhaul, won a large-scale war in which they had originally expected to fight an uphill battle, and conquered truly massive amounts of territory that could provide the resources they needed for self-sufficiency. And yet here came the West, toting big guns and expecting compliance, and Japan wasn't able to do anything except give in. For China, the results were even worse. Not only had the Western powers not helped China gain any of its land back or even reassert its sovereignty, they had gone further, instituting their own new demands in addition to those of Japan. Now China had to give even more to the West, work even harder to meet quotas, and they would have to do it without the territory and resources that Japan had stolen away. This untenable situation would lead to years of reform and attempted reinvention of the Chinese government, and with it came revolution. The Qing dynasty would be overthrown by 1912 as a direct result of the outcome of this war. The First Sino-Japanese War is historically relevant for a number of reasons. It signaled societal change and upheaval in both Japan and China, not to mention its devastating impact on Korea. It reshaped the functional borders and territorial holdings of Asia, and was the first step in building Imperial Japan into the military and economic powerhouse it eventually became. It was an early example of the brutal, meat-grinding modern warfare that would become commonplace over the following century, and made clear how crucial large-scale mobilization would be to sustaining a war effort. And it rung the alarm bell for the Western powers, and for the world order as a whole, that Japan was not about to be a minor player in the coming years. It's easy to view this war as its own microcosmic reality, a regional conflict with ramifications that stayed neatly contained within its place and time. But in reality, China and Japan's first modern war laid the foundation for what came next, not just in Japan's regional hegemony, but in its effort to achieve major power status. It rattled China so hard that its entire ruling dynasty eventually toppled down in its aftermath, and it was, in many ways, the first indication to the world that a major global power shift was coming. Nobody knew it at the time, not China, not Japan, not Korea, and not the West. But at the expense of tens of thousands of lives, the First Sino-Japanese War would be the catalyst to start a chain reaction, one that wouldn't end until the 2nd of September, 1945.